inside the recording studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me is Mr. Chris Hellstrom. How you doing, Chris?
I'm doing pretty good, Jody. How you doing?
You having a wonderful morning?
Wonderful. I got my coffee. I'm ready to podcast, and I get to talk to you for, the better part of an hour here. So it's all good.
All right.
Yeah.
You're on fire.
I figure I'd start here and then just bring it down.
Nice.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Fantastic.
And you're good as well?
Yeah, I am starting to develop what they call the opposite of ski goggle face. This is mask face.
Right. Yeah.
Funny stuff.
It is, yeah. I was trying my best not to do that. I was out the other day in a little bit, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna look like Jody after this, right? Yay!
Well, speaking of getting and developing certain weirdnesses on your skin, we're gonna transition that into reamping guitars. I don't know how that transition works, but that's what today's episode is all about.
Yeah.
In case you don't like your skin, molt it off and change it. It's kind of like a guitar sound. You don't like your guitar sound, reamp it, change it.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah, no, it's the concept of reamping can sound sort of like mysterious, I think, to a lot of people, but
foreign.
But at the same time, it's something that a lot of us kind of do accept in software all the time.
Well, those that use software amps are technically doing it pretty much all the time if they're not printing the actual amp sound as they record.
Right. Yeah. Which both you and I would be advocating against.
That's right. It'd be like holding up the big cross.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
Yeah. For the same reasons as we'll be discussing today. But yeah, I suppose if we talk a little bit about just the software end of it first, I think it can clear up some of the concepts of what reamping does and why you might want to do it if you have the
hardware
possibility of doing it.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So
go forth.
I shall go forth.
Drop knowledge.
Let's say that you're recording your guitar straight into your interface.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially DIing the guitar.
Yes.
And recording that, you're slapping your favorite amp simulation software on that, adding an amp to a clean tone. You can then obviously change that plugin and go for a different emulation if the first one doesn't work. And that's something that, you and I do quite heavily.
Yes. Yes, it is. It's a lovely thing to be able to do before you hit a mix. You can go, this is just not working out for my arrangement. Let me try a different sound.
Yeah. And that is, I think that's the nuts and bolts of it, right? Where you envision a certain thing for the track. And this is what we want. And then it could be like, oh, you know what? I thought I wanted this, but now the song is going in kind of a different direction. So you can change from, amp A to amp B and have it be more appropriate.
Or if you really want to go nuts, you can take your same input signal and pretend like you are, say Eric Valentine, and you've got 3 different amps set up, all mic'd differently. You could duplicate that same guitar input signal that you did and create 3 software amps and then blend them all together. So that's another reason why you might want to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's that. And it's also different cabinets, or you running through a different cabinet and with a different mic setup or whatever it might be,
Yep.
So the key here, I guess, is flexibility.
Yes. And just for a quick mention on that, because you are sporting the concept of changing the cabinet and the microphone, we should probably mention the fact that we use red wires most of the time to do that. There are other companies like Wall of Sound by Two Notes. Is that it?
Yeah.
Or is it the opposite? Is it Two Notes by Wall of Sound?
No, other way around.
It's the first way I said it. And there are various companies that create impulse responses of cabinets with mics, which is essentially kind of reamping in and of itself, or re-miking a cabinet in a sense.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, all those reasons why you'd want to do that, where you want to have the flexibility or just see, or let's say um, you're tracking your guitar at home and you're really comfortable, but you don't have the best software emulations. You
Or you
still have
need to
that
keep it
DI.
quiet for other people.
Oh, yeah, there's that too, right? Where I can't get my plexi up to 19 and just crank it.
Because the neighbors
But
might start knocking on the door or pounding on
yeah,
the ceiling with their broomsticks. Yes, that's
yeah,
there are those home recordists that have situations like that. Yes.
right. But let's say that you're doing that and you have, you're going to take it to Jody and Jody's going to mix it. So you have all these nice emulations that you could throw on that later. So
Yes.
let's say if it was me, as I know, we're going to get rid of that high gain logic stuff and we're going to put on something by Brainworks. But I'm sorry, my snob is showing. But just the flexibility there. And that concept is, for most of us, a lot easier to grasp in the software world because we're just kind of used to doing that. So when we're talking about doing the same in hardware form, it seems to get a little bit more confusing because there's other things to take into consideration
Right.
when we're doing that.
Yeah. Well, actually, these kind of things should also be considered in terms of using software amps. It's just most people don't tend to do it.
Yeah.
And the first thing I think we're going to yap about on that is the signal level of the guitar.
Coming in.
Coming in, well, just
yeah.
that you have recorded, that is your direct signal. That is your clean, straight from the guitar kind of sound.
Yeah.
So as we were kind of talking a little bit about it before we hit record, I was talking about how I like to get my guitar signal level to about a -18 before I hit the amp. And I have guitars that do a little bit louder than that and a little bit softer than that. And I use a Neve preamp inside the universal audio system before I hit Logic with my guitar signal. So I use the Neve preamp to adjust the volume of the guitar that I'm using prior to hitting the signal level on the guitar track.
Yeah. Yeah. So. And now that's something that the important part there to really emphasize, I think, is to not record very hot of the signal coming in.
Well, you could. It's just not desirable.
You could, but you're probably going to get less than desirable results because you're more likely you're going to encounter clipping and all this kind of stuff. You want to have a healthy level coming in, but you also don't want there's no need to take it into the red.
This is true. Very true. Very true.
Yeah. So
how do we transition that from the concept of the way it would be done in software to doing it with physical amps? The answer is
a reamp box.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of a difference between a DI box and a reamp box. They have like little different functions. Now, today, personally, I don't do really any reamping outside the software world because I don't have to, and I'm fortunate enough to have more plugins than I probably need. But
now, come on, you've got hundreds.
Well,
you don't have hundreds of plugins, but you have choices of hundreds of amps.
That too, yeah. But that's a different
whole different
thing
story. Yes.
Yeah. But when it comes to DI boxes and reamp boxes, they do different things with the impedance, right? And when you're DIing, you're going from an unbalanced signal to a balanced signal.
And it can run further over a cable length because of it.
Right. And now we should also probably mention that should you use a DI box as you're DIing your guitar straight into your interface, you could, but you don't necessarily have to.
Correct.
So I remember, and again, we mentioned this before record again, and I think it was the first generation of Waves guitar emulation software. I think it's called GTR, where they did it in conjunction with Paul Reed Smith.
Mm-hmm.
and you actually got a physical box to get that impedance to where he deemed it should be as you're tracking. So
Right.
it's certainly possible to do that, but you don't have to. Now, going the other way is a little bit more important. Now, if you're sending your signal out
From
to,
your DAW to a hardware amp,
yeah, you need a reamping box.
or
And
it
this,
is ideal to have one.
yeah, you're probably going to discover that your tracks get really, really noisy and all this kind of stuff if you don't
Right.
have one. So, essentially, the quick schematic of this is essentially you go out from one track of your interface into your reamp box, send that with just a cable, a 1/4 inch usually, into the front of your amp.
Yep.
And that's how and then you deal with that as you would any other way, right? You mic up that cab if you want to, if you have like an IR loader, like you mentioned, like the 2 notes, if you got something like that, you could do that as well. But you're taking the signal back from the amp into your interface one more time again.
Right. Usually using a microphone in front of the cabinet, of course.
Yeah.
And you're
Right.
dialing in your amp and you're making sure it sounds good and you're doing all that fun stuff there too.
Right. So one thing to keep in mind there, I think, when it comes to your interface is you have to consider that you need to have one dedicated output going to your amp. So let's say if you have only a 2 output amp or a 2 output interface, I should say, you're going to need to use one of those to feed your amp, right? And then come right back into it.
Right.
So you might have to, well,
make adjustments.
make some adjustments when you're playing back, but at the same time, you're not mixing it as you're going along. You're just retracking it. So
Right.
if your playback at that point is a mono source, no, that's what it has to be, right? Doing the retracking. But if you got more than a few outs, less of an issue.
Yes.
But yeah, so
who makes DI boxes? I mean, what are we looking at here? We've got companies like Radial.
that would be the first one that, for me, that I kind of think about. You think about
my favorite choice too, the Radials. Radial has several different boxes and they all serve several different functions when it comes to reamping.
Yeah.
They have the EXTC, the JCR, the Pro RMP, the XAMP 2. Those are like their 4 big ones. And each one serves a slightly different function. Plus, especially when they're active and they're not passive, the active ones, depending on which model you choose, can also have a slightly different bump in the audio sound. Some will be a little bit more hyper in the high end. One of them is a little bit more punchy in the mid range because that's where that one's designed to be. So it's one of those things you want to research what you want your guitar sound signal that's going to your amp to be like.
Right.
So that you pick the right box for the job is a good way of saying it. The other companies that have things are like the TC Audio TC1. ART makes a dual RDB. Hughes and Kettner makes a Red Box 5. Little Labs makes a couple of boxes, one called the PCP, another one called the Red Eye 3D. Other companies that make these reamp boxes are Mesa Boogie, Useful Arts, and Avalon. So there's quite a few companies that make varying degrees of different types of reamp boxes. So the first thing you want to do is maybe do a little research on which reamp box is going to get you your ideal sound from your guitar.
Yeah. And I think this again can be a little bit of a sort of like shrouded in mist, and it's kind of like, oh, we got to go around the cauldron and do the right thing.
Well, and speaking of like mystical things, we should probably take a brief moment right now to say, hey, thank you to our sponsors. We interrupt this regularly tuned podcast episode to tell you that this week's 2-Minute Tuesday, even though we've kind of already discussed it, is going to feature this particular box right here. This is the Radial X EXTC. EXTC is probably a better way to say it. But the reamp box and the 2-Minute Tuesday will be featuring this box right here and how we go about using it when we're reamping guitars. Right, Chris?
Check it out. Check out the episode. Should be good.
All right. And now back to your regularly scheduled podcast episode. So what's this mystical stuff that you're talking about?
Well, I think it can get overwhelming with all these choices that you have. And I think if you're sort of like starting out with this reamping where you want to have the option of reamping, is obviously things like budget, but ultimately just thinking about what it is that you want to accomplish. And
that's a good point, because why are you reamping? Is it because you just have to use a hardware amp and you hate software, or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, it could be, let's say that you happen to have you have your own studio and you happen to have a bunch of different hardware amps that you really, really like, and
I've seen that studio.
Yeah. But it's just that flexibility, right? So that you don't have to necessarily, or let's say that you can't be present for the guitar tracking, or the guitar tracking can't be done for whatever reason. It could be scheduling or whatever at your place. Maybe there's a guitar player that gets red light syndrome and he can't play unless he's by himself, so it could be one of those things where just get your performance at home, give me a DI, and I can reamp it later.
Yeah. Well, and actually in thinking about that, one of the things we probably should mention is that oftentimes if you're in a studio situation or you're doing it at home, as you're just describing, you can record that signal that's coming off your amp, but you probably should do a split box that splits the signal, one signal going to your amp so you get that vibe that you need, and one signal that goes to the setup that takes it to the DAW for the clean signal, to give the producer or the mixing engineer that reamping option. And it's the same guitar being played in two different fashions at the same time that are being recorded. So you'd be recording 2 tracks instead of 1, or if you're multi-micing your amp, you're recording however many tracks plus the 1 direct signal for that part. So yeah,
and it again, just in the name of flexibility, and this kind of goes a little bit of counterintuitive to what we've been preaching in other episodes of the podcast when we say like commit to a sound.
Yes, it is counterintuitive to that, but there are definitely times when the option to have that additional guitar signal makes sense.
Absolutely. And
especially when the artist is not fully formulated around the arrangement of the song.
Right. And it's just, and worst case scenario is that you're not going to use it. So no harm, no foul.
Right. It's just an additional track that's there just in case. It's an in case kind of thing sometimes. But if it's dire needed for your reamping, this is why we're doing this. This is why we're speaking on this today.
Right. And, could be also that, well, this guy is going to do it. He's going to do the mixing for us, and he has this wizard amp that sounds amazing. Well, not everybody has the budget for a wizard amp. So
this is true.
So it could be like, I really, really want to get this type of sound. So you can have said person reamp that, which would be
there's another brand that's been kind of catching on that's a boutique-ish, I would think. Mezzabaro? Is that Mezzabarrero?
I have to claim complete ignorance.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
No, there's quite a few guitar players that I know that have been catching on, and I should look it up right now just because I don't want to like
Yeah. So, but while you do that, so the getting access to certain gear that you might not have would be another great way to consider reamping.
Here it is, Mezzabarba. Sorry, it's Mezzabarba.
All right. I got to check that out.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, but today it's an embarrassment of riches really when it comes to great guitar amps, where,
An
Well, I mean,
embarrassment of riches.
yeah, I think so. I mean, it
Okay.
used to be, in, well, let's say early 80s, mid 80s, if you wanted something that had a healthy amount of gain, you you essentially needed to have something modified, right? You'd take in
Yes.
so,
Whether
but
by
today,
it was like famous modifications came from Bradshaw, didn't they?
well, Bradshaw, yeah,
He was like
Bradshaw
the
definitely
top
did
of
that.
the heap kind of thing in your
He was one of
custom
them, yeah.
modifications.
Yeah, custom audio electronics, and then there were other guys doing it as well. But yeah, um, so yeah, okay. Well, we made a left turn there with that.
Keep let's steer it back onto the road.
Let's do that. So now, what else did I want to bring up when it comes to reamping? Oh, and then the choice of reamping would be, there are reamping boxes that would allow you to use your pedals and stuff like that in front of the amp as well, where you can have
Sure.
like a send and return on the box. So that type of functionality. But one point I wanted to make that I didn't make was, most reamp boxes, I'm going out on a limb here probably to say, but will have a decent functionality, and essentially the bottom line is doing the same thing.
Yes.
So I don't think it's one of those things where you have to spend the farm or take out a second mortgage to get one that's going to work for you.
Unless you want to play. Well, here's the reason why is you don't want to take to get the second mortgage or put up the farm for having, let's say you do your reamp signal that's in your recording, because you know that somebody has a connection to, say, like a Dumble,
Right.
or as you said earlier, a Wizard, or some other like famed boutique amp that is rare and
Right.
stupid expensive, unless you're, say, Joe Bonamassa. That's another reason why you'd want to do the reamp situation, is because you have the option of getting to some esoteric gear that you don't own.
Yeah.
And hopefully have it usable for your recording.
Right. Yeah. So reamping, but it's just, as I think, to sort of steer back to where we started the discussion here, is like, if we think about reamping very much in the same way as it would be to switch just to a different amp emulation plugin, that's nuts and bolts of it. That's kind of what it is.
That,
right?
well, it's not even kind of, that is what reamping is for, is so you can go back and try different amp situations.
Yeah. So it just things, now there's certain limits of how you want to do that, but a reamping box will obviously do the job for you. There are several videos online where you can watch and kind of how the pros and cons of doing all this kind of stuff, and what happens if you try to reamp a guitar without a reamp box, and the noise floor will probably astound you. Yeah. So a reamp box will get rid of all that kind of stuff, and thinking about how you're routing out from your interface and making sure you get a full signal and all this kind of stuff. So it's a cool thing to do if you need to get that other piece of gear in there. Is it a necessity?
No.
No.
Not necessarily.
But, right. Assuming you have your sound and everything that you like, and we talked about that in the recording guitars episode. But it is certainly an option, but it's one of those things that I think in some circles, it's almost like talking about modes when you're talking about music theory. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and it's like, oh, we can only talk about this at a full moon at 3 a.m. down by the railroad tracks. You know what I mean?
It was a strawberry moon. Did we miss it?
Yeah, I think we did.
We need to shut up about
another
it now.
episode. Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that mysterious. It's just like, get another piece of gear, back into it, and then you're doing it.
Right.
And but it could be fun again, right? If somebody has that amp you want to go through, or the engineer knows look, this is the way your metal guitar is going to sound the best in the mix, and I have my setup here with my cab and everything, and that's how you can do that. But
well, and if we go to the concept that we've spoken to before when it comes to the musician that is doing the performance and getting them comfortable in the situation, especially as you mentioned earlier, if they have red light syndrome,
right,
you can give them the option for them to sit there and play in the room with their amp sound so that they feel comfortable with what they're doing, even if the sound isn't technically right for the arrangement.
Yep.
You reamp this, you take the signal that you're recording that is the clean version of that signal when you've split it and you run it into the DAW, and then you can take it back out and reamp it to get the proper guitar sound that is right for the arrangement of the song. Yeah. That is also another reason for doing the idea of getting that clean signal for the reamping purposes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be sort of, from my perspective, that would be one of the big two why you would want to do it, right?
Oh,
because then sure. you're worrying about the performance, and that at that stage, that's the most important thing, because the tone we can fix later, you know,
very much so.
A reamping situation.
Yeah, so. Yeah. I agree. That definitely is like the big, in terms of like what I would do that for, that's probably the biggest reason I would do that for.
Yeah.
So that the artist themselves that's playing the guitar part has that comfort level with whatever gear it is they're used to.
Yeah.
And yet you can still get the signal that you need that is going to be the right signal for the song.
Yeah. I agree. So that's a reamping.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is that, again, in addition to, as it was briefly mentioned at the beginning, with the software levels, with the volume level, or the volume level that you use for software amps, it's the same concept for hardware as well, which is why you use the reamp box. And one of the reasons that Radial makes several of their boxes as active boxes is if you have a passive signal, so to speak, that came from a passive guitar, you can use the active signal to adjust that gain to drive the amp harder if you need that additional push into the amp. If you don't need it, you don't necessarily need an active box. You may only need a passive direct or a passive reamping box. So the big thing there is, especially with Radial, having so many choices, because that's kind of like their bread and butter.
Yeah, right.
The whole concept of getting your killer sound signal and making it as pristine as possible. They have all those choices for that.
Yeah. So, and that's brings up another point that's really important, because unless you get that pristine signal, you've kind of lost the point of reamping.
Yes.
Because if you're now, okay, I didn't have a great amp at home, now let's take it somewhere else and make it worse, you know? It is that. So just the act of reamping itself is...
It does require a well-recorded clean signal.
Right. And, when you're bringing it out into your reamping box, it takes away all the noise and with the impedance issues and all this kind of stuff. So it corrects for all of that. So you have that healthy signal going to the amp. And like you mentioned, if you have an active box and you can, let's say that you want to give a little bit more push into the amp, you can drive it a little bit more as well, kind of going in. Now, probably should mention as well is, like, when you're tracking your signal, this goes back to what you mentioned before. When you're tracking your DI, you want to make sure that you have all the dynamics of your performance doing there, or as you're recording it. Wow, that was difficult for me to say.
Easy to do, hard to say.
Yeah, because if let's say that you inadvertently clip the signal going in, you're missing a lot of that dynamic range.
Well, and not so much you're missing it, you're just going to get a clip signal in return.
Yeah. So, but that's, you're losing that.
You're losing the additional
pick attack and all this kind of stuff. It's not going to sound natural as you go in there. So whatever you do when you're recording your DI, don't compress it or anything like that. We want the pure, raw, unadulterated DI signal going in, right?
Unadulterated.
Yeah. Um,
That sounds so pervy.
Does it?
It does.
Unadulterated.
Unadulterated guitar signal. Just make it pure.
Yeah, pure. That being said, I think not necessarily anything I wanted to bring up, but anything that you would like to put a bow on this episode here, or anything else that you would like to add?
No, not necessarily add. It's just a matter of like experiment. And obviously experimenting with hardware can get a lot more costly than it does with experimenting with software.
Sure.
So if you have your budget, fantastic. Go out and buy all the different boxes, figure out which one is actually really killer for you. Or if you're a studio, you probably need versions of everything.
Right.
Which can get pricey still, but that way you give your artists that come in to record with you choices if needed, which is a good thing. But the one thing I'm going to suggest is do not go into Hawk.
Yeah.
Don't overspend yourself to go get these things just because you figure, damn it, I need a reamp box. Do you? If you do, great. But make sure you're not going into Hawk to do it, because that's just not the wisest thing to do.
But at the same time, though, when we're talking about this, it's not like these things are super pricey either.
Oh, no. You're talking maybe $100, $150, maybe 200 at the most.
Yeah. So it's not like you have to, get rid of your amp to get a reamp box,
No, certainly not.
But I would say, if you're unsure, do a little bit of research and, talk to your favorite retailer guy that you can trust that just doesn't want to sell the most expensive thing, but see what they suggest, right? Or talk to contemporaries and your peers and see what they're using or whatever.
Bug them on social media.
Yeah, but chances are that you can get away with, a box without a lot of the bells and whistles that you might not need. If you're not going to use...
if you don't need an effects loop with your effects pedals in there, you don't need a box that does that.
Yeah. If you don't, I don't use any pedals. All right, cool. Well, let's get that anyway. Well, okay. If budget is no option, go for it. And you want the flexibility, but you don't need to.
Correct.
So, I would say, just think about what your needs are, and
that's the best way to go with it. And that, I think, is kind of where I'm like, okay, we can tie a bow on it and say Merry Christmas to all you reampers out there.
Yeah. No, but it can be a fun concept. I don't do it a lot outside of the software world, obviously, but it's a very valid thing, and it doesn't have to have all this mystery around it. So it could be a cool thing. So if you get the option, try it for nothing else than just kind of experimenting with it and see what you come up with.
Get out there and reamp your guitar signal.
There you go.
And with that, we will say, see you next time.